be here for those of you who joined us for our first Feeling Collaboration panel discussion series topic. Welcome back. And if this is your first time joining us, we're so thrilled to have you here. So my name is Andrea Brandon. I'm the Science Delivery Specialist with the Northern Research Station. And welcome to Feeling Collaboration. This is a new interactive panel discussion series that is co-hosted by the Northern Research Station, as well as the Consortium of Appalachian Fire Managers and Scientists, the Lake States Fire Science Consortium, North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange, Oak Woodlands and Forest Fire Consortium, and the Tallgrass Prairie and Oak Savanna Fire Science Consortium. All of us. So it's a real collaborative effort here. And the goals of Feeling Collaboration are really to see how we can get land managers and researchers together to engage in this learning and knowledge exchange, and to see how we can do exactly this, fuel collaboration across the region. So really happy to have you all here. And just wanted to quickly note who our primary organizers are. You see their names and emails and our logos here. And again, we're just really excited to have everyone here. So today is the second event of the Feeling Collaboration series, and today's focus is on seasonality, and really asking that question, framing our discussion around the question of how can we use science-based reasoning to support burning outside of the dormant season. And so Amanda is our moderator for today and is going to share a little bit more about the topic for today and introduce our panelists and guide us through the discussion. So without further ado, it's off to you. Take it away, Amanda.
All right, thank you, Andrea, and thanks for getting us together for this really fun series. So last time, you'll notice we talked about fire history. Today, we are building on some of the questions that were brought up and talking about fire seasonality. So using specifically, how can we use fire seasonality to open the burn window? Before we dive in, I just want to remind folks that during this discussion today, we really are trying to emphasize evidence-based science. We're also going to be keeping all of you muted, and hopefully with your cameras off, so we keep the focus on the participant, sorry, on our panelists today. And we're also asking you to keep any chat window discussions respectful and on topic. We have a lot of people in here today, and we're definitely trying to juggle quite a bit of topics and subtopics within this fire seasonality theme. So fire seasonality, I will be brief, and I really want to get to our panelists quickly. The real question today is, how can we use science-based reasoning to support prescribed fire operations outside the dormant season? So some of the questions we're going to ask our panelists to address today. We're wondering, in your area, what are the common burn windows? And for all of you participants out there as well, why are those the common burn windows? Is there research that supports this? Are there regulations that support this? Is that just the practice that's been in place? What science is available in your area? And we're also wondering, what are the real or perceived impediments to exploring fire seasonality? So we are hoping to fuel collaboration and fuel discussions that will get more seasonality, more prescribed fire happening on the ground using different seasons to your advantage. So let me just briefly introduce our participants, our panelists, and then they're going to go ahead and have a more elaborate introduction of themselves. After that, we have a really meaty discussion that's going to take about 35 minutes. And we will be keeping an eye on the chat window for questions, but we'll be saving a lot of the questions from the chat window until the end, mostly because a lot of you have submitted some really good questions in advance of this panel that are going to help shape this discussion. So let me just briefly introduce our panelists. So, and they're going to introduce themselves a lot more in depth shortly. So Don Hagan is a forestry professor at Clemson University. Jack McGowan-Stinsky is the program manager for the Lake States Fire Science Consortium. Mike Gallagher is a researcher with the USDA Forest Service Northern Research Station based at Silas Little Experimental Forest in the New Jersey Pine Barrens. And Neil Gifford appears to be buried under snow in Albany, New York right now. Hopefully he'll be able to join us, but he is the conservation director at the Albany Pine Bush Preserve Commission. So my question to our panelists, and I think I'm gonna start with Jack. I'd like you to each tell us a story that introduces yourself, maybe some of your collaborators, both managers and scientists, and tell us what got you into exploring fire seasonality.
I'm going to dive right into kind of how I got into thinking about different seasons of burning. So my background in fire is a lot of seasonal positions with some State Department of Natural Resources and a lot with the Forest Service. And then really got into the prescribed burning side, working with the Nature Conservancy as a fire manager and land steward out of Michigan. So working in wildfire, we certainly did see some, burns or wildfires that happened, obviously, in the growing season. But I wasn't really thinking about the fire effects then. I mean, that was all suppression based and kind of learning fire at that point. When I started with the Nature Conservancy, the first growing season burn that I led was actually in the mid 1990s. And before that time, the prescribed burning experience was frustrating to me because of mainly burning just in the dormant season in spring and a tight time window, and also coupled with not really achieving some of the objectives we wanted with those dormant season burns. So I started diving into the literature and also talking with people. There wasn't a lot of literature available that I could find, evidence-based science on growing season burns in the Lake States area. Talking with biologists, ecologists, and fire people, I got kind of three answers. First answer was, well, you're crazy to think about burning in the growing season. So we'll set that one aside. The other two answers were it does nothing but negative effects, but nobody could back up what the negative effects were with any kind of real science. And the third answer was you can't burn in the summer in Michigan. It's too green, it won't burn, which was kind of ironic because some of the people that are saying that also had been on wildfires in Michigan that occurred in the summer. So that got me really exploring and experimenting with growing season burning and starting to tease out, the comparisons between spring, early, mid, late growing season, fall season, looking at phenology, looking at different prescriptions, kind of figuring out that fire behavior is going to be different and what's acceptable fire behavior. And we did all this usually with threatened and endangered species and also involved with invasive species. And that kind of allowed us to really open our burn window to, and at the same time narrow, and the narrow of the burn window was allowing us to prioritize each and every next burn based on kind of the primary objective and saying, well, we can shift these burn units to next spring because that's when we think we'll hit those objectives, meet the fire effects, but then also shift into the growing season primary units. So it really allowed us to kind of open up and expand from snow off to snow on how we burned. And at the same time, it also reduced some of the risk for some of the units. So an example is the jack pine units, where I did not want to lead burns in jack pine in the spring during the spring dip. It was just unacceptable risk. So we shifted into growing season mainly to reduce the risk. And lo and behold, we also got wonderful fire effects. So that's kind of my evolution of thinking about burning in different seasons based on fire effects.
Awesome. Thank you, Jack. Thanks so much for that intro. I'd like to pivot to Mike Gallagher next. So Mike, tell us a story that introduces yourself, some of your collaborators, and what got you into exploring fire seasonality.
So I'm a research ecologist at the U.S. Forest Service, Silas Little Experimental Forest in the New Jersey Pine Barrens. And in the Northeast, that's the largest contiguous pine barrens example at about 1.5 million acres, give or take. And in New Jersey, wildfire has been very important there since like the dawn of the United States, at least. And it's so similar to Jack. My experience in fire started off as just a crewman on the side while I was doing research, and we would help with prescribed fires in the spring, and then I would help respond to wildfires throughout the year. And there weren't a ton of growing season. There weren't a ton of growing season wildfires that required my help, but when a couple big ones happened over time, it really was striking to me how much they were big. So we took on this like a box and burn management technique, and burned it in with a swamp and some roads, and it became like this big prescribed fire kind of. And it really, I got to thinking about the fire effects and just how the phenology of the plants was so much different. And some places it was burning better than I would think, and other places it was burning worse because there was moisture in some plants, but not so much in others. And all these things were really interesting. And so it really got me thinking about that in fire, and how then talking with one of my very good fire manager friends and mentors, Tom Gerber, who's also a member of the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange, about how fire really sculpted this particular landscape that we were working in at that point. And it was really neat to see how this area is kind of characterized by not having too many homes. And so there's, for decades, there's been this kind of box and burn management approach, whether it's a growing season fire or a dormant season fire. And looking at all the different forest structures in that area in such a small area of a few square miles was really interesting to me. And looking at how those effects really change structure and the long-term trajectories of forest in those areas. So that, and then kind of segued into some of my research with burn severity and looking at how that might vary across seasons, has kind of been my experience.
Very cool. Thank you, Mike. Let me turn to Don. Don, if you don't mind, tell us a story that introduces yourself, some of your collaborators, and what got you into exploring fire seasonality.
Sure. So yeah, again, I'm Don Hagan, and I'm an assistant professor here at Clemson University. And I'm a plant ecologist and a forest ecologist who works a lot in fire. I'm originally from Florida, and one of my first jobs in the natural resources, I worked for the Florida Park Service in the Florida Panhandle, which is where I'm from. And I'll never forget my first burn. It was a dormant season burn, January 25th, 2000. It was my 20th birthday. It was the best birthday ever. We burned a park right there on the beach between Panama City and Destin. It was a first entry burn. And we lit that place up, several hundred acres. The wind was blowing out of the north, so it was just carrying out over the Gulf. We didn't have to worry about smoke or anything. And I was hooked. I knew that was something that I wanted to do. I ended up going to studying forest ecology in graduate school at the University of Florida, working mainly in longleaf pine systems. And while I wasn't specifically focused on fire seasonality, by working in a lot of longleaf systems that had been burned, I was able to witness firsthand how seasonality matters, particularly when it comes to the vegetation response. And really, as a plant ecologist, those are the that's what interests me the most. I mean, just such a dramatic difference in how the vegetation responds when you burn in the summer versus when you burn in the winter, particularly with controlling some of the woody vegetation. So, growing season burns have been going on for quite some time in Florida. When I came to Clemson several years ago and got plugged in with the consortium of Appalachian fire managers and scientists, and a lot of collaborators here with the Forest Service, the Nature Conservancy, et cetera, I was really excited to hear that while there wasn't really this established tradition of burning in the growing season, pretty much all of the burns were happening in the dormant season, like in that January to March timeframe. There was a lot of enthusiasm about that. There was a lot of interest among these collaborators in doing that. And so for the last several years, I've been plugged in to a couple different projects that look at comparing growing season burns to dormant season burns. Been really fortunate to have, again, some awesome collaborators who I consider friends, with these different agencies who they're open to thinking outside the box and trying new things. So yeah, I guess that's where I'm coming from, a little bit of Florida background, and now firmly entrenched here in the Southern Appalachians.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Don. Let me turn next to Neil, who is joining us from snowy Albany or even Vermont.
The Vermont border, yeah, home on the farm.
All right. So the question I've been asking folks to use to introduce yourself, tell us a story, Neil, that introduces yourself, some of your collaborators, both managers and scientists, and what got you into exploring fire seasonality.
Okay. So my name is Neil Gifford. I'm the conservation director at the Albany Pine Bush Preserve Commission. Supports a globally rare pitch pine scrub oak barrens, and it's actually the place where I first started burning as a seasonal burn crew person with Ron Myers and Stephanie Gebauer back in, oh gosh, 93, 94, I think, right out of grad school. And like Don, I was hooked after my first fire. That was all growing season fire, and quickly realized that pine barrens, fire suppressed pine barrens in the dormant season are exceptionally volatile. I worked a seasonal burn crew in Missouri for a while, but we have been with the commission full-time since 97, and as the ecologist and then conservation director. And we had, in looking at the fire history of our site, we knew that we not only needed to put fire on the ground, but that historically there were fires in the growing season. In particular, some of the biggest fires were in the growing season, historically. For about 10 years, we were only able to put fire on the ground in the dormant season because the prescription parameters we had simply wouldn't allow us to burn when the place would burn in the summer. It was typically out of prescription. It was too dry. And the drought index would be too high. So we started burning initially tried burning in the growing season, and it really didn't go. We had a near miss. We had one of our prescribed fires in the dormant season next to an area that had been burned before with head high scrub oak over huckleberry and blueberry. A plant prescribed fire of 7 acres got significantly larger, and to mitigate that risk from happening again, we started going in and mechanically pre-treating these really fire suppressed dog hair thickets of 15-foot high tall scrub oak, and realized that stuff would burn real quickly just a few weeks later, and ended up trying initially as an experiment, a 4-acre experiment, to try and see if it would burn once things got green. And our first attempt was a little touch and go because it wasn't green enough yet. So we ended up, instead of with a line of fire, we ended up with a massive swath of mowing / burning with exceptional heat that could potentially burn through hoses. So we really waited until later in the growing season, and lo and behold, what we started doing to try and mitigate risk of an escape by mechanically pre-treating these scrub oak and huckleberry and blueberry barrens turned out to be a blessing in disguise, in that it opened up the growing season window for us. The mowing / burns real hot, but because everything is green, the fire moves real slowly. And it was really an epiphany and a paradigm shift for us in opening up the growing season and not only trying to get fire on the ground in the growing season, but getting desired fire effects, in particular, eliminating litter and duff. And since kind of 2004, we've been using this combination of mechanical pre-treatments and growing season fire to restore the barrens and kind of the restoration phase of things, and then following that up with a mix of growing and dormant season fire. And it's really been a game changer for us in meeting both hazard reduction goals, but also ecological goals in a way that we were never able to do it in the first 10 years that we burned. And now it's become a standard part of our toolbox. And the collaborators with us on that were Dr. Patterson, of course, retired from UMass, but also folks from the Nature Conservancy in the state, in helping us not only figure out the logistics of those fires, but also figure out and analyze the effects of those fires to determine that, lo and behold, it works. And not only does it work, but we've been able to dramatically expand the barrens over the last 10 years, fully recover our local population of endangered corner blue butterflies and see a bunch of other rare species do exceptionally well in the places where we've been able to get growing season fire on the ground.
Awesome. Thank you, Neil. So you definitely already started launching into some of the topics that we wanted to get into. In this next section, now that we've gotten through kind of a brief intro and a taste of what our panelists today have to offer us, we really want to get into the question of what makes a growing season burn good. There are a few areas based on the questions that were submitted ahead of time. We want to make sure we talk about species and second order fire effects in different ecosystems. We want to make sure we touch on prescription parameters and refining what are your desired outcomes within the burn window, early season, late season, or out of season. We're also going to touch on some pros and cons of different seasons. We might mention smoke. That probably is worth a panel or discussion all unto itself. So we'll see what we can cover. Jack, I'm wondering if I can pitch the first question to you. Under this question of what makes a growing season burn good, I know you've had some thoughts on prescription parameters. So what makes a growing season burn good in your mind?
It's the heat output, and it's a tough one to answer in general, thinking about large regions, but it goes back to what fire effects you want and thinking both for intensity and severity across kind of that dormant season, early, mid, late growing season. And I did put in the chat box thinking about geographic area too. So a lot of my examples and monitoring is coming from Michigan lake states. So we're thinking, roughly March, April is kind of that spring, maybe moving into May. When we get into that late May, June, July, we're kind of in the phenology of growing season. August is getting late growing season. And so, we kind of teased out the positive and negative effects using competitive species or non-native species as an example. If we burned in those dormant seasons and we had invasive species that were aggressive, we typically made them happy. If there was any kind of seed source, they just responded. So if we were trying to use fire kind of as a tool to reduce them by shifting into that mid-growing season, it really knocked the teeth out of some of the invasives. Some of those direct effects, some of it more have been indirect in the sense of giving the competitive advantage to a lot of the native plants that did well with growing season burns. And then when we look at, a lot of the native forbs, we were missing a lot of those forbs. And if we could shift it throughout the growing season, we could kind of break up that dominance that was created by just burning in the spring all the time, or by not burning at all, and start to get kind of co-dominance or a lot of diversity and start seeing some of these forbs that were not real common actually come back really well just by shifting the season of burning. So it was a lot of monitoring, adapting, saying, well, that didn't quite work, and not getting discouraged by saying that didn't work. It's not fire that's working, it's how we're applying fire. And also thinking from the aspect of residence time. I'm a big one on saying, man, if we can keep some of our fires really slow moving, and kind of dig into that duff and get that heat output, we often can accelerate the process. That has obviously other risks to operational factor. And as we move later in the growing season, you can get into higher severity, and that's part of how you plan too. So I don't know if there's follow-up questions or if that was getting at what you want, but.
Yeah, that's great. And I'd invite Mike, Don, or Neil to jump in because I'm sure you have thoughts you want to tag on to what Jack just said.
Yeah, well, I think growing season fire is good because it's intentional. And I think there's a misconception sometimes about wildfire and prescribed fire, and just because something's a wildfire and it happened in the growing season, it's like magically gonna save everything. And I think it's important to point out that most wildfires, like 99% of wildfires, at least in New Jersey where I'm at, and this isn't the case for everywhere, but are human caused in one way or another, meaning they're not random. So that's your 4th of July fires because of fireworks aren't actually random. That's a social construct too. And there's not really an ecological purpose to those fires, at least not that anybody's like planning out. And so growing season fires are I think just the planning aspect of it, that they are intentional, and that they're leveraging like the things that Jack was talking about, phenological differences in plants. I kind of have this like this conceptual diagram that's basically a 4-pointed, I'll call it a diamond, but it's basically weather, fuel, that would be fuel structure and loading, plant phenology, and ignition pattern. And those are like the things that you can leverage in a prescribed fire to reach a goal. So, the weather's different at different times of year. The phenological conditions of plants have variety, and they don't all change together either. All the plants aren't all flowering at the same time, and then all dropping their seeds at the same time, and then all going to sleep for the winter at the same time. And so they have their own competition and their own strategies, and so there's lots of different points to take advantage of that intentionally. And so that's, I think, the intentional burning of growing season fires is what makes it good.
Thanks, Mike. Don, were you going to jump in?
Yeah. So again, I tend to look at things from sort of a vegetative lens, and in my mind, a good fire in my region is one that enhances landscape level heterogeneity, controls some of those undesirable species, some species that are maybe off-site, and then encourages the establishment of those desirable species. And I'm particularly am interested in some of those understory species, the grasses, the herbs, so forth. And the Southern Appalachians is a tremendously complex landscape. So within a given burn unit, you might have every possible combination of elevation, slope, aspect, you name it. And historically, I think when fire was more common here, that complex landscape in combination with fire, which burned variably across that complex landscape, would create and sustain a range of different forest types and plant communities. In the absence of fire, what we've seen here and elsewhere is that the forests tend to just get sort of homogenized, right? And that sort of goes along with mesification. Those more aggressive species that are oftentimes fire sensitive just sort of take over the whole landscape, and those lines, between community types get sort of blurred. And so when we think about using fire as an ecological restoration tool, not just a fuels reduction tool, a lot of the managers in the Southern Appalachian region and scientists, recognize that these traditional dormant season burns, while they do reduce fuels, oftentimes come up a little bit short when it comes to actually changing composition, right? When it comes to actually enhancing that heterogeneity. And that's true even with repeated burning, and even sometimes when those burns are used in combination with, understory, other understory fuel reduction treatments. So a lot of the motivation behind wanting to use growing season burns sort of centers, I think, around that. And interestingly, one thing that we found through a project that I'm working on with a couple grad students, Matt Vaughn, who I believe is here, we found by looking at early growing season burns, right, sort of in that sort of, transition when the species are starting to leaf out in the spring, we see greater variability in fire behavior in the early growing season. And those fires, to Jack's point, also tend to be hotter, and they also tend to consume a little bit more duff. And so, and just in general, they're more variable in their behavior across the landscape. And so that variability in those first order effects, I think, is going to translate into more variability into the second order effects in terms of how that vegetation responds, right? So variability in fire behavior might translate to variability in the community assemblage that results from that. And we're seeing that to a limited extent. We're only looking at, in the case of the study I'm referring to, only a single burn. But we do appear to have a little bit more heterogeneity developing in response to those growing season burns. And also those growing season burns were more effective at controlling red maples, both seedlings and sapling-sized red maples, and also mountain laurel, when red maple and mountain laurel are two of the species that managers are concerned with here. One thing that we're not really seeing, unfortunately, at least not with a single burn, is that sort of herbaceous response. That sort of seems to be the most elusive thing that we're trying to achieve, is getting those herbs to recover. But we do see the biggest response in the herbs when we are burning in the growing season. And I think with repeated burns, if we can open up that canopy a little bit more and also continue chipping away at that duff, I do think the understory will respond.
Awesome. Thank you, Don. Neil, you want to jump in?
Sure. I mean, I agree with pretty much everything that Jack, Mike, and Don said, but for us, I don't know if anybody has looked at a map of where we are, but we are, the Albany Pine Bush Preserve is sandwiched between the capital city of Albany and the sister city of Schenectady. It's incredibly urban and fragmented. So for us, a good burn is a burn that's relatively low stress and manageable from the perspective of the burn boss and the firefighters. And that's been the other big thing that growing season fire has helped us do, is that we end up with, because everything is green and it takes so much energy to evaporate all that water in order for the fire to advance, we end up with really hot fires that push the smoke straight up and away from smoke sensitive areas, but that also move relatively slowly relative to the same fuels in the dormant season. So from a manager's perspective and a burn boss perspective, and from the perspective of the fact that every burn we have, the smoke is visible from the governor's office and the legislators in downtown Albany that fund our program, those growing season fires really let us have more effective fires that are also a lot more manageable and less stressful from the manager's perspective. And you put that together with what Jack, Mike, and Don talked about, in particular, and timing it right with plant phenology, means that you get an entirely different level of effect at the same site than you would in the dormant season. When everything is dormant, I mean, it burns largely from stem to stern because everything is dry enough to burn. So you don't get that heterogeneity, but you also, because all the plants are asleep basically in the dormant season. So the effect is largely uniform. In the growing season, as Don alluded to, the plant phenology varies over the course of the season. So there's a huge difference whether you're burning in, early May, late May, when things are just greening up, to when you're burning in July or August, because the phenology of the hundreds of plants that are out there are just dramatically different, from first emerging to the fact that they've just exhausted their root reserves to put out the new foliage and the flowers and whatnot to later on in the season. And that has a big impact on the heterogeneity of the fire effects that we get, which in turn for us, there are 78 rare animals in the preserve alone, a couple of rare plants. So I think Don really hit the nail on the head, that heterogeneity impacts the ability of a given site to produce habitat for that wide variety of plant and animal species. One fire doesn't fit everybody, but in the growing season, because the effects are variable, and we see much more dramatic effects. The pine bush sits on this massive field of sand dunes. So you have a lot of heterogeneity with aspect and slope. So north facing slopes and south facing slopes and high and dry and low and moist. And that too helps to build in that heterogeneity of fire effects. So for us, a good fire is one that is manageable, keeps the funders and the legislators happy, or at least not knocking on our door, but also that has the desired effect that we want. We never saw that combination of things in the dormant season. It was dormant season fires were good at trying to help us reduce fuels to a degree, but not in meeting the ecological objectives that we had targeted.
Thanks. Anybody want to jump back in and tag on Anil? We've also got plenty more questions. Something that I've been hearing in this, it's really hard to disentangle in terms of objectives. It's hard to disentangle the objectives, the ecological objectives, from the human management challenges in the different places. So I'm wondering if you guys could each speak a little bit more to what changes minds, I guess. How does in maybe before we get into the kind of the socio-political side of things, I guess how much of a driver are ecological objectives in the landscapes that you work in, and how has that been able to get all the stakeholders that are involved, whether it's the landowner, the neighbors, different agencies that are involved in potential wildfire escape response. How have you been able to use ecological objectives to drive prescribed fire goals outside the traditional dormant season burn window?
Amanda, could I start with that?
Please do.
So I think that that's a really good point, disentangling ecological objectives maybe from other objectives. And that really, I think, gets to the heart of maybe some of the reason why things are the way they are. Particularly, I can speak mostly for the Northeast. But prescribed fire for ecological objectives came second to a need to reduce wildfires back at the start of things. Our origins come from fires, monumental fires, catastrophic fires of the late 1800s and early 1900s that were burning communities down left and right, and the need to actually restore forests, but more from a forest structure standpoint of degraded landscapes from industrial use for fuels, for different industries. And so, the prescribed burning was a necessary tool to harness the fire regime that we'd kind of created culturally just by cutting and having all these industries and all these activities that we did that set everything on fire left and right in this scrubby fuel. And so I think that's some of the backstory as to maybe why there's not so much literature on, everybody thinks that there's some like breadth of literature out there for all this stuff, but for a long time the objective was preventing wildfires. And so I think I'm getting away from the original question here. I had a point. Amanda, what was the original question?
Well, you pointed out that it is difficult to disentangle the role that ecological objectives play in driving the prescribed fire season. So you're definitely getting into that.
And so part of that too influenced the legal ability to burn at different times in different places. And so there wasn't always the opportunity to experiment over, in previous decades. It's not like we lost growing season burning that was just being done and then it just went away. The origins of this weren't ecological goals necessarily at the beginning. And so I think harnessing, that appreciation's grown over the past 100 years, and the need for that's grown over the past 100 years, and reflects changing cultural needs too. And so I think it can be difficult to disentangle them. And I think it's also important to appreciate that you can't do everything everywhere all the time. And that kind of speaks to what Don was saying about landscape level heterogeneity. And, you don't have to have heterogeneity in every burn block, but landscape level heterogeneity that's picking out objectives here and there and getting that mosaic can actually be liberating, I think, kind of, where you don't have to manage because a lot of these things will have competing interests. There's some things that are mutually exclusive when it comes to, ecological restoration or management. So anyway, those are my thoughts on that.
Thanks. Neil?
Yeah, I guess I'd like to go next just because I'd like to juxtapose that. So for us, our initial impetus to burn was largely ecological, almost exclusively. We didn't have the wildfire history and problems that Mike and the folks in the Jersey Pinelands have had, but the pine bush was recognized as one of the best remaining examples of this globally imperiled ecosystem, home to a bunch of rare species, including the Corner blue. So ecology was one of the drivers for us, but growing season helped us meet those goals. But Amanda, you asked about changing minds and how, right? So for us, it was difficult for us to try and put fire on the ground in the growing season. In particular, folks were really worried about smoke, and smoke is one of our primary concerns, again, because the preserve is so fragmented and urban. And we were able to change minds by starting small and utilizing examples. And our initial growing season burns were only a couple acres in size. Our initial experiment was a 4-acre experiment. And we've been able to demonstrate, first and foremost, that we could do growing season burns safely. And that, well, yeah, we're putting up a lot of steam, right? Because again, all that moisture that's in that live foliage has to go somewhere. Yeah, so you do produce what appears to be more smoke. But for us, because we were doing these mechanical treatments first, that residence time that Jack talked about and the heat produced from all that mowing slash allowed us to burn in lighter winds, which opened the window, our burn window up, our logistical parameters up. So we actually ended up burning under lighter winds, which meant the smoke was more likely to go straight up. So we produced a lot of heat with a slow moving fire that pushed all that smoke up and away from smoke sensitive areas. But we gradually moved and were able to change the minds of fire departments and local officials and the public at large with burning in the growing season by demonstrating that we could do it safely and effectively.
Awesome. Thanks, Neil. Jack or Don, you want to jump in?
Sure, I'll go. I think Mike and Neil pretty well summed it up. But in my region, I think that historically, fuel reduction was a primary motivation of a lot of these burns. And when there were ecological objectives, they were typically pretty narrowly defined around, one or two species, right? Burning to maximize oak regeneration or pine regeneration or whatever, but not really an ecosystem perspective. And I think that's changing, particularly, through some of my collaborations with the Forest Service. I get real excited, when a silviculturist or an AFMO sends me a text or an email and says, what kind of plant is this? And it's a little wildflower, or they have questions about diversity and species richness and things like that, I don't know, maybe weren't being asked 20 years ago. So it does seem like there's a shift towards more of a holistic ecological perspective on burning. And I also think there's a recognition, like somebody has mentioned, that fuel reduction objectives aren't independent of ecological restoration objectives. One of the biggest challenges we have here is this massive accumulation of litter and duff from a long period of fire exclusion. And I also think that accumulation of fuels is one of the reasons why we have lost a lot of our understory species. So reducing fuels goes hand in hand with restoring understory species.
Jack, you want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah, it gave me time to actually kind of listen to you guys and then think about not repeating just what you said, basically. So I guess my experience again is, like I said, when I did the intro, when I first approached growing season burning or implementing it, some people were calling me crazy. They could not do it. And that's changed. There's a certain cultural shift, we got a lot of people right now on the audience who are curious or have done different seasons of burning. And we're learning to tease out what those effects are more and more. So, my background again is entirely ecological. That was the focus is, can we use fire in different seasons and assess both the positive and negatives? Can we knock back invasives? Can we promote, more of the native species? Did it affect any of the threatened or endangered species or actually promote them? And can we expand habitat? And I think a couple examples of how we kind of got others to look at growing season burning and start evaluating on their own. I think of some actual field examples where, somebody from the Forest Service they were frustrated because they had knapweed as a big problem. And they were trying to burn it out and they kept having knapweed. And it's like, well, yeah, because you're always burning in March. And that's perfect for knapweed, nothing else. So you shift that into the growing season and you can start using fire kind of as a negative. It has a negative effect on knapweed. Same thing with Pennsylvania sedge and red maple. By shifting into kind of that active growing season, we're actually able to deal with the competitive species, break up that competitiveness or break up that dominance. We had a person that had no clue about fire, but they really knew state-threatened sedges. And they were ecstatic leading a field trip because suddenly they were seeing sedges. They're like, we don't have evidence of these sedges since the last 60 years. What did you do different? We started using different seasons of burning. It wasn't just growing season. It was a combination of dormant season, growing season, herbicide, removal of shrubs, kind of the whole management rolled together. But it was that combination of seasonality. So that's, I think it's getting people out taking a look. There are a number of people in the audience here, I believe, that maybe did some of their first growing season burns in the last couple of years, and maybe even this last summer. And that was maybe less for ecological reasons, but because with COVID, they had an opportunity to get out more in the summer and do the burning, so they tried it. So there's other reasons people are trying it. Aside from ecological, it's trying to open that burn window and assess. So,
cool. Thanks, Jack.
Sure.
Any quick responses from our other panelists?
Yeah, just the point that Jack made, he intimated about competitive advantage. And that to me is the biggest beauty of growing season fire, or utilizing growing season and dormant season fire for different purposes, is that you're managing competitive advantage. You may not eliminate the species you don't want or get a species you do want in a single burn, but you start giving advantage to species that you want and giving disadvantage to species you don't want. And that is tremendously important in kind of rebuilding ecosystem function, which is ultimately what we're trying to do.
Thanks, Neil. Oh, go ahead, Don.
And to Neil's point, yeah, and a good example of that from our region, a lot of folks want to control red maple, and we have a lot of large red maples in the overstory that we're typically not killing with prescribed fires. But red maple flowers and produces seeds basically in the late winter here, in early spring, and is dropping those seeds. And we're finding that you have a huge reduction in the establishment of red maple seedlings when you burn in the early growing season, because you're burning them up right after they fall. And so that's giving potentially a competitive advantage to some of these other species in the understory, maybe the oaks, maybe gives them an establishment advantage over the red maples. We've also found through another study looking at sapling size red maples, we burn some individual trees, a different sort of cohort of trees every month of the year across different seasons. And then we found that if you burn red maple in like right after they leaf out, you see much less vigor in their resprouting response. You burn red maple, you burn oaks during that same time, they resprout pretty much with the same vigor. So that combination, I think, of knocking back the seeds, the seed source, and then knocking back the seedlings, or the saplings, I'm sorry, might sort of tip that competitive balance more towards some of those desirable species that managers prefer, like oak.
Yeah, that's a really good. Those are really good points. I think also, there's a fellow in the Southern Research Station, Joe O'Brien, who I've talked with a few times, and we seem to get in these conversations about the seasonality of fire and the importance of phenology. And I think one way to think about plants is that they've kind of got this, they've got kind of like a gas tank there in their roots of carbohydrates and things to work off of. And in the wintertime, it's all in storage, and in the springtime, they spend some of that to, leaf out and stuff. And if you can knock them when that investment's all out there, it doesn't take long to recover that investment. Sometimes for some plants, within just a few weeks, they've gotten back into the black, and they're gaining interest on their investment into their leaves. But if you can knock that investment out, right away when they leaf out, that's a vulnerable point in the plant's phenological period, and that might not be a long window. Some folks were talking about in the chat just about early growing season fires and late growing season fires, and should it be a monthly thing? And it really depends on the plant that you're trying to either favor or damage. But the window to impact them, greatest might not be the whole growing season. It's probably actually a brief window. And you might not always have weather to burn that plant in that window either. Some years it might just not work out. Don was talking about maples, and there's some places that I think, on some properties that I visit frequently, that I think it'd be really neat to kill some maples back there. But just the conditions, it's never dry enough at the time when they'd be most vulnerable. And so I'm always like waiting for some magical year where the conditions align to that somebody could like burn them. But so I think thinking about that though, and that, the phenologies of all plants don't track, quite the same through the year. And so there's different windows of opportunity for different species based on whether they're flowering or leafing out, or already stressed, but because of maybe an irregular drought period or some flooding or something. And so maybe you can also leverage a point where there's been another seasonal damage that to kind of give them the extra punch that they need if it is in fact something that you're trying to get rid of.
Thanks, Mike. Oh, go ahead, Neil.
Yeah, just that both combined, Don and Mike's points, alludes to the fact that we need to use other tools as well. We can't expect that fire alone, even in the growing season, is going to do everything we need it to do. Red maple is vulnerable to early growing season fire if they're the right size, if they're young enough, if they're small enough. Larger mature trees, you're not gonna really wipe them out or set them back significantly with a growing season fire alone. So going in and doing mechanical treatments or chemical treatments in combination with these growing season fire treatments can really help advance both ecological goals and fuel management goals.
Hey, Amanda, there are actually two papers that I'd like to quickly introduce. I didn't send them out earlier, but I think they really tie in. When would be a good time to do that?
Yeah, you can email them to Jen and she can post them on the website so that anybody who's participating today can go and get a link to it. If you want to briefly just explain the titles, that'd be great. Thank you. So
there's a paper, the first paper that I like is actually really recent, and it's about the mechanisms of seasonality effects on plants. It's by Miller. It was from 2019, and him and his co-authors list 7 mechanisms by which seasonality impacts plants. And it's a really neat conceptualization of what you're really leveraging, what your opportunities are and aren't. And it's things also like seed sources for other plants. So like if you want something to invade in, is that seed source available when you're burning and prepping the soil? And there are things about the pre-fire seed bank being there or not being there. There's an 8th factor in another paper by Keith from this year that also suggests dispersal changes at different points in the year. And that's a really important one too, because whether you've got leaves on plants or no leaves on plants really affects the airflow. And so a lot of seeds are dispersed by wind, and that's an important thing. The other paper that I wanted to suggest, and then I'll be quiet here, there's a paper from White in 1991, and it was a long-term study on prescribed fire seasonality and frequency, the Santee experimental forest in the Francis Marion National Forest. And I really like that paper. There's one really cool figure in it that really elucidates the importance both of seasonality and fire frequency, and showing that you get different mixes of things from each of those factors, whether it's fire season, dormant season, growing season, or repetition. And we haven't talked about repetition, but there's a really nice figure in there. And if you're a manager who wants to show somebody that three growing season fires might not be, or I'm sorry, 3 dormant season fires might not be equivalent to 1 growing season fire, or there's not like necessarily these equivalencies there, but actually divergent trajectories. And so that paper is a really nice one to maybe frame that.
Awesome, thanks. And we had a couple links dropped in the chat window to some papers. I'm going to turn to Jen, who has been more closely monitoring the chat window. Jen has a good question to pose to all of y'all.
Yeah, so I've pulled a few of the questions together and some of the questions from when people registered, and it seems like we have a lot of questions about barriers to, non-dormant season burns. And so maybe the panelists can go through and talk a little bit about which barriers you've dealt with. Is it regulations? Is it endangered species? Is it health hazards of burning in hotter weather? And maybe talk a little bit about how collaborating has helped you overcome those barriers, or was building a collaboration the barrier in itself?
So Amanda, you kind of referenced this in the start, and I think you did, with talking about kind of real impediments versus perceived impediments or barriers, and they can be the same thing depending where you're coming from. So, my experience work with T&E species, I mean, we had to go through a lot of regulations to do this, but it was really working with the biologists and ecologists, which I'm a biologist too, but getting them out there, talking through the pros and cons of fire, and thinking from like the impediment of rare species. I'd like to kind of flip it on its head and pose it as a couple questions, and see what others think of this. So, we think of fire as bad for killing individuals, and it does. We know it can. I mean, we have to face that fact. But if we flip it on its head, how many individuals of a species does the lack of fire kill? I mean, if we're talking a fire-dependent species that lives in, an animal species that lives in a fire-dependent system, we know that, fire can kill an individual or direct or indirectly injure it. But if you have the loss of habitat, whether it's actual, loss of it, or it's the quality, like we've been talking about, loss of diversity, so on, I think we should be thinking about from that perspective. It's not a no fire, it's how can we get fire back into the system, restore the quality and diversity, but minimize impact to those individuals. And then from that perspective, an impediment for rare species, thinking about fire as a mortality factor. Well, it's not the only mortality factor any individual faces. What are all the other mortality factors they face? And is fire a cumulative thing? So if we're too frequent, or if we're doing it at the wrong season, could we actually be increasing mortality, or can we shift things and reduce that? So I'm not one of these that would say fire, no fire. And I'm thinking more from the perspective of the habitat in multiple species. But having worked with individual species, you can still do different seasons of burning, but minimize the impact on, the individuals of a certain rare species. And then we can get into other impediments, beyond the threatened and endangered, depending on what you want to talk about. But thinking from threatened or endangered rare species impediment, I kind of pose those questions as kind of part of the answer.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. Anybody want to go ahead, Neil?
Yeah, we saw the same thing, and we had obviously a lot of questions from the state and federal regulators, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Department of Environmental Conservation about using fire in corner blue butterfly habitat. Corner blues, right, state and federally endangered. And for us, really, the answer, we were able to work with them to get the necessary permits by demonstrating not only that we could manage the fire, but that we would leave adequate refugia. And our permits ended up requiring that we can't, for example, for an individual occupied subpopulation of corner blues, we can't burn more than a third of it in a given year in any season. And we don't burn adjacent thirds in consecutive years to ensure that there's always adequate refugia. So initially when we had only a few sites that supported corners, we could not put fire into those sites until we were able to demonstrate that, one, we could create more habitat, and two, that we were able to manage the fire in a way that ensured that we left enough unburned habitat that's occupied to allow the butterflies population to recover. And lo and behold, that's what we saw. We routinely burn occupied habitat now, And, you know, when I first started here in 97, I don't know, we had maybe, what, 13 acres of Carner habitat. And if we'd be lucky to see a couple hundred butterflies a year, and in 2020, you know, we're up to over 700 acres of Carner habitat and 45,000 butterflies. And we're routinely burning a lot of that habitat and seeing that they do relatively well. We have we definitely need to be careful of not doing too much too quickly in any one spot, but there's a balance there.
Thanks, Neil. Don, I wonder if we can turn to you kind of with Jen's question about, you know, how can collaborations help overcome barriers, whether they're real or perceived?
Yeah, so in my experience, collaboration has been really key to overcoming these barriers, you know, and I think the consortium for Appalachian fire managers and scientists has really been at the forefront of that by helping sort of encourage the, you know, managers to expand their burn window and start thinking about growing season burns. So, you know, those collaborations have been very fruitful, and really since I've been here, it hasn't even really been a barrier. I mean, people want to burn in the growing season, and we've been successful at doing it. So I guess in a nutshell, that's sort of my answer. But there still are barriers. You know, most of the burning in the growing season that I'm talking about is in that early growing season window. And there are some potential, to kind of segue into what we were just talking about, some potential issues with off-target impacts on you know, wildlife species, for example, when you burn in that window. And so one barrier that is still present, we still hear it a little bit, is, you know, turkey hunters and so forth are concerned about burning in the early growing season. But then I've seen some pretty avid turkey hunters and that community start to get involved with the Southern Blue Ridge Fire Learning Network. And I think that there's a recognition, you know, whether it's science-based or if it's just intuitive, that the effects on habitat enhancement, right, of burning in the growing season maybe offset the short-term impacts on individual animals or individual populations. That said, I would still love to continue to expand the burn window to include later growing season burns, because that's not something that we're currently doing here very much. And one of the big impediments to getting those done, and I guess this sort of ties into collaboration, is that the resources oftentimes aren't available in the late growing season here, because so many folks are out west, and so many of the resources are out west fighting wildfires. But I think that there is some emerging evidence that late growing season burns, as opposed to early growing season burns, might be just as good, if not better, at bringing about change in the community, maybe in the biotic community, and maybe without some of those negative effects on in the early season that you might see on certain wildlife species. We had one late growing season burn in sort of a woodland restoration site a couple years ago, and it was a collaborative effort with the Forest Service and some other folks. And the response of the understory vegetation was remarkable, and we're seeing forbs and stuff come up in that site that we're not seeing really anywhere else.
Thanks, Don. Mike, do you have any quick thoughts on collaboration helping to overcome barriers?
I think, I don't know, just broadly, I just always think that collaboration really helps people cross ideas and see different perspectives. You know, that certainly has been helpful as a researcher too. You know, both, I think that's been a nice product in New Jersey and in the Northeast. You know, I got to do growing season burning with Neil, and I still think about that time when we did a growing season burn up there, and just how the fire behavior was different, and it changed my perspective a little bit.
Thanks.
Yeah.
All right, yes, go ahead.
Well, I was just point out, I think kind of some of the personal barriers people maybe face is comes back to often a lack of evidence-based science, and we're seeing more and more of that, which is great. Like I said, I had very little of that. You know, we collected a lot through monitoring data and so on, and we're on the right track. But you know, sharing stories like this really helps. So that's one kind of impediment to get over, that there is more and more science out there to kind of tease out pros and cons. And then the other is this perception of fire behavior. And I've heard so many times of people the first time they're on a growing season burn, I mean, they're ready to shut it down for some of these. They're like, that's doing nothing. The flame lengths are in inches. And so it's recognizing again that heat output, and there can be very different fire behavior from dormant to growing season. That doesn't make it good or bad. It's really thinking about the effects on the plants. And Mike, you brought up, and Don, you did too, you know, thinking about the phenological stages of different plants at different times. If we're talking plants, same with animals. So it's kind of getting over some of those personal barriers, discussing it, getting out on these growing season burns where you can, and don't giving up if one doesn't work. Because I had somebody say that once. We tried one growing season burn, it didn't work, we're never doing it again. And I asked them, you mean to tell me every one of your dormant season burns always meets your objectives? So the reality is we learn by doing. So if it doesn't work, don't assume it doesn't work. It maybe didn't work that time. Tease out why it didn't work.
Nice. Thanks for that encouragement.
So Jack,
go ahead.
I know we're almost done. Jack just mentioned that, you know, trying things again and working together, and there is a lack of research for you know, there's gaps in the region, in different regions of needing research for different parts of seasonality. And I think, you know, if you can connect with your researchers and scientists and teach them to, you know, I always remember there's one manager that was very much against like growing season prescribed burning in my neck of the woods. And I remember him arguing red in the face about it. And one day, you know, and we're friends now better than ever before. And he came to me and said, you know, you can teach an old dog new tricks. And like, you know, my mind has been changed a lot. And I think my mind also as a researcher has been heavily changed a lot too. And that is how, like, a big way that we're able to accomplish some of this research that's needed. And you can facilitate that in your own areas by being open to new tricks yourselves.
Thanks, Mike. I want to turn to Don and then Neil, and then Jen is going to tee us off on the Q&A because we've had some really great questions coming in, and I want to make sure we get to a few of them. So Don.
Yeah, just one more quick point about collaboration. You know, a lot of the burns in our region are, you know, they're collaborative. They're larger scale burns that, you know, involve bringing together people from different agencies and organizations. The Nature Conservancy is one of those, and I know there's some Nature Conservancy folks here on this call. And I've got a colleague, Tom Dooley, who works at the Nature Conservancy here in South Carolina, and he uses the phrase "no regrets burning," which I love. In his mind is, you know, if you can burn safely, give it a shot, you know, and see what happens. And every day is a burn day potentially. And so we don't need to be thinking necessarily about these short, you know, windows when you can't burn. And the cool thing about these interagency collaborations is that you have people with that mindset working alongside on the ground with people with maybe a different mindset, and working alongside with researchers like myself, who can, while there's not a whole lot of published science on necessarily burning in different seasons, we can go out and observe those effects, and we can, you know, that can inform future research questions. So no regrets burning is something that I've kind of taken to heart.
Great. These are excellent tips for collaboration. Neil.
Yeah, and Don, Tom is the one that helped us open up the burn window initially back in 2003 and 2004. But collaborations are critical for us, as the name suggests, right? I work for a commission that's a combination of the Nature Conservancy, 2 state agencies, 3-4 local municipalities. You know, it's the mayor and supervisors. That's the board of directors that I effectively work for, and all of their staff come out and help us burn. And, you know, much like Mike came up and helped. And it's the staff from those agencies coming and helping us, the rangers, their equipment, the personnel, making the resources available is critical to every one of the burns that we do. And what's been really fun and rewarding to see is that having those folks come and help us has helped them appreciate what they can do on their lands. So we're now going and helping DEC burn. We're going and helping state parks burn. We're helping state parks write burn plans and trying to meet ecological objectives on some of their sites. And it's the collaboration and the teamwork has grown as a result of all of us working together at our particular site, and it's now branching out and helping other agencies put not only growing season but any fire on the ground, and that's been really rewarding to see.
That's
Just a
awesome. Thank you.
quick follow-up.
Go ahead, Jeff.
Neil, you hit a really good point. And I think about when we started doing stuff, we were essentially the guinea pigs. We were like the gophers sticking our heads up because we were trying something new. We were out of this traditional season, all that kind of stuff. So there was a lot of questions, a lot of flack, everything else, but we persisted and got people out there to really look at the transparency of the good and the bad. So that's why I encourage other people, don't be afraid to try it, but really evaluate how you're doing it and then be willing to share what works and what doesn't work. Share it through pictures. I mean, I got tens of thousands of pictures, and it can turn a conversation right around if somebody says, well, you can't burn in that system in the growing season. All you could do is show them a picture. I can show them a picture of a fire in July with the timestamp, and they're like, oh, well, I guess you can. So yeah, kind of be a spokesperson yourself too, to figure it out.
Thanks, Jack. I am now going to turn to Jen and make sure that we get to some of the great questions that have been coming in. Y'all, this has been a really great conversation. Jen.
Yes. Okay, so since we are getting closer to the end here, I wanted to take a second and maybe ask some questions about longer term effects of growing in the or burning in the growing season. Sorry, mixing up my terminology here. Burning in the growing season. And maybe if you can touch on how let's see, our grad student Heather asked how forest ecosystem services like water filtration, carbon sequestration, nutrient cycling, et cetera, how is that affected by changing the season of the burn?
And I'll just add, you don't all have to answer the question. If one of you wants to jump in first, I see Mike is unmuted. Go ahead, Mike.
I'll take a little bit of a stab at that. So, it's going to impact respiration and basically water use of trees and also their water use efficiency. We've published some interesting papers on that in the New Jersey Pine Barrens about how comparing insects to fire and how that impacts ecosystem processes like water use efficiency, carbon uptake and respiration, and kind of where there are some balance points. And so basically, if you're damaging the foliage or the vasculature of the plants, you're going to impact all those different things. And so for instance, you might get greater groundwater recharge where you've got less respiration going on, or you might get more surface flow. And that could also be because you've got less interception of foliage. So when it rains, a lot of the moisture actually re-evaporates before it runs off or goes into the ground. That's kind of the quick answer.
Thanks. And we're going to probably go for quick answers here. Thank you for sharing that, Mike. Jen, you have another question? Neil, you have a quick PS in there?
Yeah, just that we haven't been burning long enough to fully understand the long-term effects yet. But from our perspective, where we've been doing growing season fire, it's really helped us restore more natural fire dynamics by turning heavily woody thickets of scrub oak, huckleberry, and blueberry back into these mix of, the general public, I call it a grassy shrubland or a shrubby grassland. But that not only gives us habitat, but it also gives us the ability to put more frequent, less intense, less severe fire on the ground and restore the fire dynamics that this system, we believe, evolved and was maintained by in the long term. So we've only been doing growing season for 10 years, but it looks like that's the trajectory we're moving into by turning these sites from shrublands to more grassland, much like the way, many sites like Longleaf and others in the southeastern coastal plain, how the maintenance fire regime is relatively frequent, low intensity, low severity relative to the catastrophic fires we see after decades of fire suppression. So I think we're on the right direction, but only time will tell.
Thanks. Jen, do you have another question for us?
I do. And this is something it's another question that's sort of come up with the registrations as well. And it has to do with the public. And I realize you all are not directly public information officers or communications people, but I'm wondering if any of you have stories about challenges in dealing with the public when you change the seasonality or the season of the burn, and how you might have dealt with them, or if you've gained public support, or if you can touch on any challenges that occur with socioeconomic factors and how those impacts might change if you are burning in the growing season versus the dormant season.
Well, we had a growing season wildfire this summer, not far from my house, so I helped out on it. And I guess one of the interesting things about it was everyone thought it was a prescribed fire. All the locals were like, "Oh, why you prescribe burning?" Like, I guess they're doing prescribed burning. Some people didn't really care. Some people were like, "Oh, this is interesting. It's about time." What was interesting is that nobody thought it was a wildfire. There were fire engines everywhere. And I think culturally, because we have so much prescribed burning, yeah, I thought that was kind of successful, that people like weren't, you know, they were so confident that like the fire managers had it under control. So that was a good thing. Just a small little anecdote there.
Interesting. Neil, I saw you unmuted yourself. Go ahead.
Public engagement is critical to every fire for us, no matter where we're burning. If you think about it, the interstate runs through the middle of the preserve, lots of other secondary, tertiary roads. There are literally tens to hundreds of thousands of people that see and are affected by our fire, potentially affected by all of our any one of our prescribed burns, smoke, because of smoke in particular. So we do a lot. We work with the Thruway Authority. You know, in New York, the interstate is managed by the Thruway Authority. They have these variable message signs along the thruway. So when we're burning, they put that message up, you know, prescribed fire in progress. We have massive traveling billboards on wheels that we set out, you know, right after we burn. There's hundreds of phone calls that are made before we burn. There's an annual postcard we send out now to like 7,000 preserved neighbors every year. Part of that postcard includes a survey so that folks can, hey, get on. If you want to be called on the day we're burning, anywhere, or if we're burning in your neighborhood, let us know. There's an opportunity for them to give us feedback through an online system. And we have an incredible education and outreach staff that blooms to close, 10, 15 people in the summer. Constantly, fire is part of every single one of the education and outreach programs that we do, because it is so pivotal to what we do in our urban environment. But I guess as far as engaging the public and dealing with the public effectively, reaching out to them is essential. I'll leave it at that.
I might add also engaging and interacting with your other local fire management agencies, like local fire companies and stuff, can be just priceless. With that fire that I mentioned, that growing season wildfire that ended up being a small, burn, we had to burn it in because it was caused by an electric line, so we couldn't be putting water all over that. But the local fire companies came out, and they had such a capacity for water that we were able to get them, this is right by a shopping center in a neighborhood, and they really put the smoldering out, which was like, Tom Gerber was like really concerned about the smoldering and saving all these big trees. And it really made the fire, like, took it from a wildfire to a successful management operation, really, which was really cool. And it was only doable because those local people had been involved and communicated with and were ready for their role. And it all worked like clockwork.
Thanks. We have just a few minutes left. I think we might be able to hit one more question. And Jen, I've been seeing with one eyeball, Adam Warwick has been asking a lot of good questions. Do you want to pick one of his to maybe pitch to Don?
Yeah, Adam's full of great questions and answers usually, if I know Adam. So let's see. So he talked about, or one of his questions was, what do you think about mesophication as a barrier to growing season fire? And what about other tools? Meaning, and he goes on to say, mesophytic species leaf out early relatively. They absorb more moisture, hold it longer, and have less combustible energy. So early canopy closure increasingly work against season prescribed fire.
Yeah, that's a good question, Adam, and I'll try to keep it short. Yeah, so mesophication is a barrier, and I think it's one of the reasons here in the Southern Appalachians why, when we talk about growing season burns, our window for doing that in my mind, our best window is the early growing season before you get full canopy closure, because it's, there's just so much moisture held below the canopy. The mesophytic species do oftentimes leaf out earlier, though, than the non-mesophytic species. And I think, especially if we're talking about small individuals, like the trees that you can actually kill with a prescribed fire, there is a window, just like we talked about earlier, where those individuals may be more susceptible to mortality. And we've seen that with red maple in particular. So what was the rest of the question? I'm trying to remember the rest of the question now.
Go ahead, Amanda, if you.
No, that's okay. And how important do you think it is to use mechanical and chemical treatments to open up more of the, April to May Southern Apps window?
Oh, I think it's essential, because you've got, mesophication has been going on for so long that these trees are now, dominant overstory trees that we're just not killing with prescribed fire. So I think a combination of some silvicultural treatments like harvesting, if you can use that to open up the overstory, that's going to allow more sunlight down. You can get more air movement. The fuels will dry out. You don't have your seed source anymore. And I really think if we really want to change the structure and the composition of these forests, those sort of combination treatments are probably essential.
Yeah, I would agree that that's really important. That airflow thing and sunlight penetration is really important too. I was just going to add that Jesse Cry has done some nice work on the flammability, comparing some mesophytic species and xeric species of the eastern United States. That's pretty interesting. They're not all the same, so that's something to consider. And then also moisture content, live fuel moisture content varies throughout the season, and so that might be something that's leverageable for a novel growing season burn.
Thanks, Mike. Jack, do you have any thoughts that you look like you might wanted to jump in on the mesophytic species question?
It's just kind of to add or support what Don and Mike just said. I mean, that my experience, rarely can fire do it. I mean, when it's that far along the line, you got to use other tools in your toolbox, and include thinking about, if you have a duff layer, reducing that down, kind of convert it over from a leaf layer to, more herbaceous layer. Unless you have, luck out with some, drought seasons or something where fire can be, more severe, you got to use a bunch of other tools. And then Mike, I'm trying to think what you just said. There's one more point you had made.
I think live fuel moisture maybe, or flammability.
Yes, yeah. Just the flammability. It's earlier in the growing season or mid growing season, you have more fuel moisture, live fuel moisture too. So your heat has to override that. So it's kind of timing that in a little bit too. So it's kind of, again, it goes back to how are you directing your heat output and when.
And Jack, and I'm sorry, Amanda, I'm going to interrupt again real quick. Probably everybody knows this already, but it's not all just about like one prescribed burn and one and done, but it's about the whole, regime of management. And, I've seen that in New Jersey time and time again, particularly when you have a piece that hasn't been burned in a long time. It takes a couple burns and they get easier. The first ones can often be the hardest burn, the most frustrating or whatever. But as you do it, it gets easier. That forest opens up, it'll dry better in the future. You'll get a better mix of finer fuels in there, and subsequent burns. And I think this would apply even with mesophytic species. Once you start it, it'll get easier.
Thanks.
If I could just add, Amanda, it's the community engagement piece to using those other tools has been critical for us. We have had so much more opposition to cutting trees and mowing and using chemicals in the preserve than we do for any of the fires we've ever had. That when we start cutting trees in a nature preserve, that is very counterintuitive to people, but it is essential to be able to get the right kind of fire on the ground. So again, that community engagement, and that's been one of the biggest barriers that we've been able to, we continue to try and overcome, is engaging people and helping them understand what Mike just said, that you have to use multiple tools if you're really looking to get to those ultimate ecological and fuel reduction goals.
Thank you, Neil. I really hate to cut this off, but even with just these 4 speakers there, we couldn't touch on all the topics that everybody wanted us to address. We've been talking about having a repeat of this series, and we might have 4 or more new panelists that will have even more perspectives to share. But please join me in a virtual round of applause for our panelists today, Mike, Don, Jack, and Neil. And before you go, Andrea wants to give us a teaser for our upcoming panels.
Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, this discussion was just amazing, and as we're going through this discussion and reading through all the questions coming through, it's just reaffirming to me that we need to keep this going. So if you like what you hear today, please join us, and I hope you can see my screen here for our next 2 topics. So we do have 2 additional feeling collaboration discussions already planned and in the works. So these are January 21st, we will be talking about fire and climate change. And then on February 18th, we will be discussing timber management and prescribed fire. And at the bottom of the screen here is a link back to our site where you can register for these 2 discussions. And so again, thank you everyone for participating today. This was a phenomenal discussion. I really enjoyed it. And we hope to see you back for our next 2 topics.